Pokémon Black and White, Generation 5. A lot of people see these games as the great divider of Pokémon. There's Pokémon pre-Gen 5 and there's Pokémon post-Gen 5. Then you've got these games slam bang in the middle, like they're breaking up a schoolyard fight. I came to these games super late. I played them for the first time a couple of years back, and I made a video about my initial impressions that ended up being this channel's first hit, I guess. But it was just that, first impressions. I've always wanted to create a longer, more comprehensive video. It's been nagging at my brain for the last 12 months. So here it is. I've had another playthrough. Let's settle in for a big ol' retrospective of Pokémon Black and White. Punching straight in, we get this lovely little cutscene at the beginning as we slowly zoom into Unova town. I'm realising I still don't know how to pronounce it. Which we've got prime real estate in, by the way, right in the middle here. And in our bedroom, we're immediately acquainted with our rivals. They very much come to us in these games. We'll have a little section on them in a bit. For now, we need to choose a starter Pokemon. Now usually this is the easiest decision in the world for me, because Snivy is the only one I actually like between these three. But I am conducive to change, so I actually chose my least favourite of the three for this playthrough. I think if you look at just the final stage evolutions for these three, they look like a really good trio of starters. But for me, the first and second stages are what maybe let them down a bit design-wise. That's just my opinion though, be sure to let me know yours in the comments. It's mostly a typical start to a mainline Pokemon game. Despite getting our starter at home, we do still go to meet the professor at the lab. Professor Juniper is probably in my top 5 Pokemon professors. This could just be me and my algorithm, but surprisingly I don't see much fan art around Professor Juniper online. I feel like that's a good yardstick for how popular a character is within the Pokemon sphere. Maybe we just need a remake to finally happen. There's probably a whole generation by now who haven't properly experienced these games, outside of messing around on an emulator. Then we take our first steps onto Route 1, which the game makes a pretty big deal about. We and our rivals basically hold hands to cross the threshold. It's kind of a humorous moment in my opinion. And then we head onwards to Accumula Town, which I think gives you a perfect sense of the increased visual depth these games brought to the table. These games toe the line between 2D and 3D, but you can see just from Accumula Town that we have deeper staircases. There are up and downs to the map. You can really feel the changes in elevation. It doesn't feel like you're walking across a perfectly level plane for 99% of the game, and it adds a lot to the experience. It's like an extra layer to the Pokemon world we hadn't had before. So yeah, the early openings of the game's pretty impressive. Obviously it seems like nothing considering how far 3D has come now with modern consoles, but this will have been really awesome to see at the time. So I guess that segues quite nicely into the Unova region. The headline news here is that Pokémon Black and White were the first mainline titles to take place outside of a Japanese-inspired setting. The Unova region takes heavy inspiration from the city of New York and its surrounding areas. And you know what? You do feel that shift in tone and in culture. This region is bigger, it's louder. It definitely has a more modern feel to it compared to the previous 4. There's huge skyscrapers and steel bridges and busy ports. It all has this way more industrial feel to it. But it also sprinkles in those quieter rural locations too. I think it's a really eye-catching contrast actually, going between locations like Nimbasa City to places like Mistralton City. And I think this generation as well is the one where the towns and cities really start to show a bit more eccentricity. What I mean by that is, I'm no longer looking at locations as the Rock Town, the Bug Town, the Fire Town, etc. They have a lot more depth to them beyond just what kind of Pokemon the local gym leader uses. That's still very much incorporated, and it should be, it makes sense, but it's not the city's entire personality. Castelia City is overtly the region's central pivot, a big bustling city that all the other locations sort of spider out from. And you know, even now, coming up on 10 generations of Pokemon, I think this city is still the most alive a Pokemon location has ever felt. The way the buildings tower above you, the NPCs constantly zipping by. The scope of it is something we'd never seen before, and in my opinion, something we haven't truly felt again since. And even among all this metropolitan space, they still found room for some classic Pokemon additions. Caves, forests, even a desert. So you do also get plenty of respite from the sensory overload of all the busy cities in Unova. It does feel like Unova is a region designed to be travelled on foot. You basically never need to use the Surf HM to beat the game. To cross the waters, there's always a path or a bridge. Bridges are a big part of this game. I reckon they're as famous as the cities themselves. If and when remakes land in our hands, I think the views from the bridges is something I'll look forward to the most. I think Pokemon should do this more often. I think it's a way more natural feeling transition between cities than running across a bunch of fields or surfing across a big open stretch of water. I like the Unova region a lot. I enjoy how active it feels. You can feel this whole economy moving around you while you travel through it. Even the time of year moves around you. There are 4 seasons in this game. Depending on which real-life month you're playing in, it affects how the game looks, as well as which types of Pokemon can spawn in certain areas too. I like the winter aesthetic myself, but feel free to let me know your favourite Unova season in the comments. I wonder if Game Freak considered this region a risk, with it being the first one to not take Japanese influence. I mean, if it was, it clearly paid off, because we haven't had a Japanese influenced region since, aside from Kitakami if you want to count that. I touched on the different kinds of Pokemon there, so let's move on to the Pokédex of Pokémon Black and White. A very bold and gutsy decision was made with the Pokédex. Until you defeat the base game of Pokémon Black and White, you can only encounter and capture Pokemon that were introduced in this generation. Unova natives only. No Pikachu, no Eevee, no Lucario, no Dragonite. Not until after the credits have rolled. What a brave decision that was. A very daring creative swing from the developers. It's a tired cliche nowadays to say that Gen 5 was intended as a soft reboot for Pokemon, or the video game side of it at the very least. But it kinda was. It split people's opinion. I personally think it's a good thing on your first playthrough. I like using only new Pokemon on my first playthrough of games anyway. I like to force myself to engage with the new additions, so a bit of bias from my perspective there. But for a lot of people, it's taking away a lot of what Pokemon is about, and that is the choice of which Pokemon you use. Also, it feels like a little bit of a kick in the teeth that you do get to use other Pokemon eventually, but it's in the post-game, where most of your adventure is already over. It's a hot topic, so definitely drop any thoughts you have on it down in the comments. A lot of the Pokemon introduced in Unova, you can tell are filling the shoes of certain Kanto Pokemon. It's almost as if they've looked at the Geodude line, for example, and thought, if we were to give the OG 151 a different 3-stage rock line, what would that be? And then there are of course some Pokemon that are just completely new and completely detached from that whole concept. Personally, I don't mind Game Freak doing this. I don't think there's any issue with looking at an existing line of Pokemon and being like, let's take the exact same brief and just see how things come out this time around. And it gives you more options as well, which can only be a good thing. I think before this, if you wanted a tanky rock type on your team, it was a case of, okay, guess we're off to find a Geodude. But now there's an extra choice. You could grab yourself a Roggenrola instead. Some really strong fan favourites came out of Black and White's Pokédex though. Zorua, Krookodile, Stoutland, and also a few more contentious ones. I'm looking at you, Elemental Monkeys. I always throw myself in the line of fire by saying that I actually quite like the Elemental Monkeys, although I will say I like the base forms mainly. I think the evolutions were probably the main problem for a lot of people. If I could take evolutions away from the Elemental Monkeys and replace them with evolutions for Plusle and Minun, I would in an instant. I mentioned that I'm not a huge fan of the starters apart from Snivy, but they're a strong enough trio. They're just one of those starter sets that are a bit inconsistent in terms of which designs I like. So I actually really like Samurott, but I'm not a fan of Oshawott or Duott. And then the polar opposite way around, I like Tepig, but not Pignite or Emboar. But yeah, we have this same argument with every bunch of starter Pokemon. I adore the Gen 2 starters through and through, but I'm sure there are many people who would disagree and rip them to shreds. Personal preference. I think this was the generation where people started to kick up more of a fuss around inanimate object Pokemon as well, because we do have Pokemon here based on like ice creams and trash bags, but the series has always had these kinds of Pokemon. I think the difference here was more that these ones are based on more intricate, man-made objects. And I also think some people felt like the monster aspect was being slowly stripped away from pocket monsters. Bug types got some big love in this generation. A bunch of really cool and legitimately viable Pokemon for the late game in here. The box legendaries are still some of the best to this day, I think. A lot of great Pokemon introduced in Generation 5. A lot of Pokemon in general. 156 new Pokemon got added in Unova, which as of recording this video, still stands as the largest number of new Pokemon introduced in a new generation. There was probably a joint effort with this Pokédex to pull in new players, but also entice some older players back in too, with a bunch of new designs that felt fresh, but also pretty familiar at the same time. Black and White threw some new battling methods at us in Unova too. Double wild encounters can be found in darker patches of tall grass, which, cool idea, but so annoying if you just want to catch one of the Pokemon, but you've got to knock out the other one before you can throw a Pokeball at it. And even then, if you want to weaken it, you have to attack with both of your Pokemon, meaning you can run the risk of knocking the wild Pokemon out. It's workable, but just an extra thing you have to be mindful of while you're playing. There are triple battles with certain trainers at some points, with 3 Pokemon on each side of the battlefield, kind of overloading to look at. Tagged onto that are triple rotation battles. They're a lot more rare to come across, but a little easier to navigate in my opinion, because it's essentially a one-on-one but with the Pokemon tapping in and out. So there was an attempt to shake up seemingly every single mechanic within mainline Pokemon here. I feel like I definitely wasn't the target audience for these new battle styles, but I can imagine them being pretty fun for the hardcore battlers out there. As of recording, we're cusping on the release of Pokemon Champions, a dedicated Pokemon battling game, so maybe these things are something that game could add in as a niche battle mode at some point. We'll see. I'm small-brained though, so I'll stick to the 2v2 VGC system, which even there I make some hilarious mistakes. If there's just one thing you walk away from Pokemon Black and White remembering, it probably is going to be the story. I think these games really raise the bar for the narrative of Pokemon games. It's a story delivered largely through the game's central conflict, that being the evil team of this generation, Team Plasma, and the enigmatic character known as N. It does something you wouldn't really expect Pokemon to do, and that is question the entire concept of Pokemon. Question whether it is morally right to catch and battle Pokemon. On the surface, Team Plasma acts like most other antagonist teams in Pokemon. They interrupt things at various points in the game, they occasionally pop up for little boss fights, the usual stuff. But they're also constantly preaching about Pokemon liberation, how we should all set our Pokemon free. They're very open and front of stage about it too. They want to be visible to the public. They're not this underground organisation working in the shadows like a lot of other villain teams. And it's weird because, in some sense, they're not wrong. Pokemon do get captured and boxed in the computer, traded around, and sometimes forced to fight for the wrong reasons. So it plants a seed of doubt in your head about the whole philosophy of Pokemon. But of course, there is a twist. The leader of Team Plasma, Getsis, is manipulating this message for his own ends. He doesn't actually want to free all Pokemon. He wants to monopolize them basically. If no one else has Pokemon but him, then he becomes a superpower very, very easily. N, who we briefly mentioned earlier, is an antagonist who was specifically groomed to fulfill the desires of Team Plasma. He was raised by Getsis, so he genuinely believes this stuff. He isn't preaching to manipulate, he's actually invested in the cause. He's the most interesting character in my view, and no doubt a lot of other people's too. And I think it's just the nuance to his character that makes him so interesting. There's so much to learn about him, and he isn't just trying to beat you either. He's trying to understand you, and attempting to hold a mirror to our character instead of simply being antagonistic. There's so much you could dive into with N. He needs a whole video at some point. He's one of the most fascinating characters, not even just in these games, but the entire franchise. It's a very human kind of evil in this game, isn't it? Preaching something noble, then exploiting the reaction to gain power. I think that makes Getsis a very realistic boss villain in that sense. And it's theatrical in how it weaves towards its conclusion. These conflicts of truths and ideals, each one being embodied by one of the box legendaries, and everything ends up coming to a head all at once. The champion battle even is all part of that wider story coming to a raw and hard-hitting conclusion. N is not quite what you would call a rival to us though, but we do have two distinct rivals in this game. First up, there's Cheren. He's probably the closest thing to a traditional rival we get in the Unova region. He's more serious, methodical, kinda bookish, the kind of guy you can imagine practicing his Pokeball throws in the mirror. Cheren's thing in these games is growth, and not just in an outward methodical way, but in a very personal way. It makes sense in a game with all these philosophical themings floating over it. He wants strength, but he's also chasing purpose. He doesn't just keep fighting you out of habit, he's wrestling with what it means to take on the world. Why does strength even matter? So he's a traditional rival in a sense, but he pushes you forward with a bit more nuance and spotlight on his own journey. Then there's Bianca. She's just kind of a vibes character at first. She's bubbly, sweet, optimistic, but definitely a bit scatterbrained as well. You kind of see her as the easy rival early on, but her role really does go beyond being a rival you simply battle. Bianca becomes the grounding heart of our little trio here, and she has her own conflicts in play as well. Her father desperately does not want her to leave home through sheer worry that she isn't ready for the big wide world, and she desperately wants to get out there and explore, experience new things, and prove to everyone that she is strong, she is capable. Bianca doesn't want to be the strongest Pokemon trainer in the world. She simply wants to find her true place within it. It's a long road for her, but she does eventually find her path in becoming Professor Juniper's assistant at the Pokemon Lab. So her arc through Black and White is largely one about self-worth, finding your own little corner in the world where you feel at home, and also what it takes to do that. Curiosity, bravery, and obviously in this case, a love for Pokemon. So a well-balanced trio of main pro tags, I think. I think what makes these two rivals so effective is how they aren't built around you. They have their own lives and their own motivations that are very detached from ours as well. And so we grow together as a direct result of growing individually. I think that's pretty cool. Cheren challenges your concept of strength, Bianca challenges your concept of success. It was a refreshing shift at this point in the video game series. I remember I wasn't too impressed with these rivals at first. I think in my initial impressions video I actually pinned them as a weak point in the games, because they do require a bit more attention investment. You might not get it right away with them, and I've mentioned before that I am a bit of a Pokemon boomer in that I actually do weirdly like a one-note antagonistic rival. That one's on me, but these two give you far more depth. They're not the flashiest or the toughest or the most meme-worthy, but arguably they're two of the most real rivals we've had in the series, and so they absolutely deserve their flowers for that. You know what does purely test you for strength though? The gyms. The gyms in this game are shockingly inconsistent, but in the best way possible, because they're more flamboyant than ever in Black and White. Along with being hefty roadblocks along your journey, they're also world-building devices. The first gym teaches your basic grass, fire, water type matchups. There's a gym inside an operating Pokemon museum. There's one in a roller coaster park. None of these gyms feel like an afterthought. Clearly so much time has gone into giving each of these a strong personality and a place within the wider region's story. This region has some of my favourite gyms in the mainline series. I miss Pokemon gyms having this level of character. In fact, funnily enough, I remember the themes and interiors of these gyms more than I do the gym leaders themselves. I'm actually hard-pressed remembering the Pokemon these gym leaders use off the top of my head, but the overall vibes of the places, immaculate. There are some really cool gym leaders though for sure. Drayden is the best Dragon-type gym leader we've gotten to date in my opinion. I also like Skylar a lot. Clay is a hell of a character too. The gyms in Pokemon Black and White give us the best of both. They challenge us, but they also entertain us. Defeating all those gyms will grant us access to the Elite Four, the final challenge on the road to being the very best. But as we'll find out, this is no ordinary Elite Four challenge. But it does start off pretty normal. We go room to room challenging the greatest trainers the Unova region has to offer. The rooms these Elite Four trainers reside in are so thematically loaded as well. Clearly a lot of attention went into creating these rooms, and they're exactly what the Elite Four should always have in my opinion. Each room should hit you with a different feeling. They should be intimidating. It should feel like you're intruding on a titan of the region. Crazy that these 4 elite trainers still only serve as the preamble for the true climax, as after we've defeated them, we're confronted by N, who has already defeated the champion older. Then a huge freaking castle comes out of the ground, we're reunited with all the gym leaders to take the 7 sages of Team Plasma out of the equation, there's a big ol' battle of the legendary dragons. On a first playthrough, this probably blew so many people away, because it's not the norm. Usually, when the Elite Four have been beaten, it's a simple case of defeating the champion, and then it's congratulations, you are the GOAT, and the credits roll. But Black and White has its story climaxing at the same time. So N is essentially the acting champion now, but kinda not at the same time. You know the concept of an anti-hero? N is kind of an anti-champion in Pokémon Black and White. It drives home that this isn't a normal power clash we're going into here. It's an ideological clash. And even then, it's not over. The big Team Plasma boss gets this, barges in, and unveils his true plan about getting everyone to surrender their Pokémon so that only he controls Pokémon. And so we have to battle him as well. This definitely feels more like a traditional champion battle, because as soon as the spiel is over from him, he just wants to destroy us. The gloves are off, it's an unhinged scrap for power. And once that's over, there's a weird sense of calm actually. There's no glorious Hall of Fame scene, no coronation as the new champion. We just sort of end on a quiet goodbye. It just leaves us to sit with our thoughts while the credits start to roll in. But this whole thing leaves a hell of an impression. Like I said, rather than a traditional champion after the Elite Four, we're confronted with a climax of shock and emotion. Probably the most memorable endgame for me in mainline Pokemon, because it just combines everything. Usually the story climax is distanced from the Elite Four. It most often comes before we head to the Pokemon League. But I think this is a good idea to have everything swell up at once. Sword and Shield kinda did the same thing with the whole Chairman Rose Darkest Day thing. So it's looking like it definitely wasn't a one-off. A special ending for sure. But hey, there's still plenty to do after the ending of these games too. I did make a little video on the post-game of Black and White, but we can have a little dive back in. Craziest thing for me coming back to this is the extra locations the post-game adds to the map. Usually that's a DLC kind of deal these days, but we have a few new towns to explore after the credits have rolled. There are a bunch of intense battles to jump into, including a very famous one with the Sinnoh champion Cynthia. Famous because it can seriously mess you up if you're not expecting it. It's a bit of an overused meme at this point, right? But despite only playing this game for the first time a couple of years ago, I still went into this completely oblivious. I knew that it was a thing, but I didn't know where the battle took place. I didn't know where Cynthia was hiding out. So yeah, I was just exploring these houses in Undella Town and boom, ambushed. I got the authentic ass-whooping experience here. There are more legendaries to catch in the post-game. We get to chase down the sages of Team Plasma and soak up a bit more lore around them. There are new caves, new ruins to explore. This game absolutely spoils us with post-game content. While a lot of post-games around this time were a case of, great job, here are some extra bonus battles you can do, Black and White says, okay, now you've grown up, here's the rest of the world. All the previous generation's Pokemon are added in here again too. So, I mean, if you wanted to, you could assemble a whole new team to explore the post-game with. I've got to give a brief minute for the soundtrack of this game too. Pokemon always delivers with their soundtracks. Even the games that have been heavily criticised, we've had to admit that the music was still absolutely banging. And Black and White delivered some really memorable and iconic music. Accumula Town continues to be a regular feature in so many Pokemon creators' livestreams. Driftvale City is an absolute bop. I personally really love Sky Arrow Bridge's theme. There's a lot of bouncy energy in these tracks, and the overall soundtrack comes together really well considering all the different blends of instruments and styles. Yeah, like I said, the soundtrack is always going to be the hardest thing to critique in Pokemon games in my opinion, because the quality of them is pretty damn consistent. Pokemon Black and White stand out as one of the boldest chapters in the franchise. It was a soft reboot that split the fanbase at first, but seems to be almost universally revered looking back. Everything we knew a Pokemon game to be got a few extra layers added to it, or in some cases completely reimagined. And it's the kind of thing that only a clean slate gives you true license to do. It might not have been what people expected, but it was certainly what the series needed at this point. And they are the perfect proof that Pokemon can take big risks and deliver something special. Even now, all these years later, these games continue to resonate. There's just so much here. Every time I make a video on the Unova games, I always get comments saying, "You didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that." And yeah, the videos would just be far too long if I went into every nook and cranny of this region. And I don't think you guys deserve to be stuck with me for quite that long. So I pick out my own highlights to include. And these are the games I'm most fearful of when it comes to a potential remake. Because you can't slip up here. You need to give these titles the highest level of care if you're going to try and reimagine them for newer consoles. Good luck, Game Freak, I don't envy you there. So why don't you guys share some of your thoughts, your memories, and any other ramblings you have about Pokemon Black and White down in the comments. I'd be interested to read them. Please do drop a like on the video while you're down there, that's a huge help. Subscribe for more Pokemon videos, special thanks to our channel members, and of course join the Discord, we love having a good chat over there too. Thanks so much for watching, take it easy, I'll catch you in the next one.